Welcome back to Black News Tonight. Another day, another conversation about masculinity and homophobia in hip-hop. And this time, it's rapper Turk from the late 90s New Orleans hip-hop group The Hot Boys. He recently made some comments that were not so hot, and now he's receiving some heat for that. When asked on a recent interview with VladTV about the co-founder of Cash Money Records, Birdman, kissing the younger members of Hot Boys on the lip, such as Lil Wayne and Turk himself, Turk said, and I quote, "We were young. It's just like somebody hitting somebody on the back when they're playing basketball. It don't mean they're gay." Joining me now to unpack Turk's comments and discuss masculinity in hip-hop is Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. He is James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University. Mark, good to see you as always. Let's get the first thing out of the way. First of all, why is this still a conversation that we have to have in hip-hop culture?
It's a conversation we have to have in hip-hop culture because it's a conversation we're not having in actual Black communities. The fact that we don't have really dense, substantive conversations about sexual identity in Black communities, right? It plays out in ways that animates, right, our both and almost what's the word I want to use? Our ignorance around some of these issues and our unwillingness to take them as serious issues within the context of our community, right? It becomes another way. The way that we talk about sexuality, in this case, queer sexuality in Black communities, speaks to the ways in which we marginalize actual queer folks in our community.
And Turk didn't even seem to understand that that's what he was doing throughout the interview, being sort of defensive in his demeanor. Sort of his takeaway point was, we weren't even gay, right? And this idea of the fear of being seen as gay, the fact that he had to keep adding disclaimers that he wasn't gay after like every sentence, that kind of fear. And I don't want to make this a hip hop problem. This is a broader problem. Talk to me about why that is the case.
It killed me, right? Because listening to you say, sometimes we play gay games. I'm like, okay, what the hell are gay games? And then he adds penitentiary
Right.
games. I'm like, what are you talking about, right? But again, even as he's trying to articulate this notion that if you're comfortable in your sexuality, right, you don't have any problem with doing things that folks might read as gay. But at the same token, the same energy that you expound, trying to make the point that I'm not gay just reinforces that particular notion. Look, I'm a 55-year-old cisgender heterosexual man who's had any number of intimate non-sexual relationships with Black men, right? As elders, as fathers, as younger folks in my life, et cetera. And at no point did I ever feel the need to qualify those relationships and those interactions by saying, this is not gay. It just speaks to a general immaturity. And an immaturity that I think gets manifested even more so amongst entertainers, simply because they're not really spending any serious amount of time thinking through these issues with people who seriously these issues.
And it's so ironic on some level, right? Because there are a few spaces more homo-social than hip-hop. It's a bunch of dudes hanging with each other. A bunch of all-male crews kicking it. Dudes talking about, love my, but where my, right? Like, I'm looking for my dudes. I'm looking for my ends, right? It's fascinating that despite all this homo-sociality, and you know what I mean, there's so little space to unpack it and say, look, maybe it's okay to have those bonds you just talked about, Mark. Maybe it's okay for us to show affection and love for each other without having to say pause or no homo after every sentence. Maybe we could just be together in a certain kind of loving, bonding way that's not even sexual.
But again, it gets back to me the point of how we think about, LGBTQ folks in our community, right? And if we marginalize them and reduce them to the least element of their identity, it manifests itself in relationships that we have with each other that folks think might look like what they think those relationships are, in queer folks in our communities.
That's important because that's another piece of this, both at the hip-hop level and just at the broader societal level, right, is how do we think about queer folk or gay, bisexual, lesbian, transgender, et cetera, people in our community. How are Black, because there are people watching this right now who are going to say, that ain't just Black people. Don't isolate or pathologize black folk. How do we understand that in the context of the black community, but also against the backdrop of an American society and a global society that's deeply homophobic?
You know, I'm sensitive to folks who don't want to cast the black community as the idealized homophobic community. We know that we have a long history of folks who were closeted within our communities, who contributed to our movements and our artistic goals and what have you. But at the same time, you know, there are always these pressures around representation. And I think the black community still reacts in certain kinds of ways to representations of black folks that they read as non-traditional. And, you know, so you think about some of the responses to Lil Nas X as just one example of this, right? You know, it's a much about the flamboyance of the performance, right? And what that represents in comparison to what we think of as a normative black masculinity, if you will, you know, as it is, you know, real questions about black identity in this moment.
I think about your book, Looking for Leroy, and of course I'm a Luther Vandross stan. And you have a chapter on Luther Vandross. And one of the things I think about with Luther is, and Craig Seymour talks about this in his book on Luther, Luther didn't want to come out to the public, right? He said, I didn't want people to know I was in the life, or people don't know I'm in the life. So there's this way that we had to pretend that we didn't know Luther was gay, or that for decades it had to pretend like we didn't have a sort of understanding of Little Richard's sexuality. There's a way that we had to almost separate these people's extraordinary contributions to us from their sexual identity in order to have them inside of our community. We do the same thing in hip-hop culture. We do the same thing in the black church. And I only got 30 seconds. Is there ever going to be a moment where we can liberate not just them, but ourselves from those kinds of blinders, from that type of boundary, that type of sort of honest, quite frankly, dishonesty?
You know, white supremacy dehumanizes us. And I think too often we use the gaze that white supremacy gives us to look at ourselves to continually dehumanize certain aspects and certain people within our communities. There's no getting away from that. You know, once we can really detach ourselves away from the power of white supremacy, we can have really more honest conversations about what black humanity looks like.
Man, it's stunning to me. I mean, when I watch Birdman, you know, kiss one of his rappers or hug one of his rappers, when I watch people say things like "I love you," but then got to add the quick pause caveat, right? Like I ain't gay or nothing, but I love you, bro. It's like, and again, I'm not pathologizing black men here. I think this is an American problem. This is a global problem. But like you said, the fact that we're smuggling in some of the same tactics and formations of power that white supremacists inflicted upon us, it makes the work even harder and even more challenging and honestly more depressing. Anyway, Mark, I got to run because they're making me end the show, even though I want to talk to you for another 20 minutes. I'm going to have you come back another time. But everybody, grab this book, Looking for Leroy, and he got another book coming out soon. I'm saying it on TV so that he got to finish writing it so that I can pub it, so that I can enjoy his brilliance some more. Everybody, we're in the midst of Black August, though, and we keep talking about love, study, and struggle. As we talk about love, study, and struggle, we got to have a clear freedom dream. We got to have, as Robin Kelly talks about, we have to have a clear vision of what freedom and justice looks like. And it's not just liberation from white supremacy. It's liberation from homophobia. It's liberation from transphobia. Freedom means the freedom to be yourself, to be who you want to be who you desire, to be what not just what the world wants of you, but what you want to be deep inside. So we can't be out here liberating ourselves from white supremacy if we're going to oppress queer brothers and sisters, if we're going to oppress trans brothers and sisters. No, we got a lot of work to do, and that work is intersectional. Anyway, family, I'm wishing you a night of peace, love, and justice. Yodi Tuwalde is up next.